Tomorrow is PREPTOBER, and you need a process for how you're going to prepare for NaNoWriMo. Here's one for you using John Truby's Anatomy of Genre. Now, this book was published, I think, in December of last year or January of this year, so it's the first time you can use Anatomy of Genre for NaNoWriMo. Very fun, very exciting thing. And this is going to be a video and process that is heavily centered on theme, because the Anatomy of Genre is a book that is heavily centered on theme. Now, if you've been around my channel before, you've definitely heard me talk about John Truby. I love him. His initial book was The Anatomy of Story. I think it was published in the 90s. It is a great Bible with tons of techniques for how to write a really good story. I highly recommend it. I have a gazillion videos on it. We'll also link those below, but definitely check that out. What that book doesn't touch on, though, is genre. And so here in this massive tome that took like 6 years for him to write and is quite unlike anything else that's been published, to be honest, because I have never seen such a deep dive into genre ever before. And that is what this is. It is in depth on 14, I believe, core genres. Now, John Truby's ethos, I'm going to kind of tell you what's in the introduction here, because this book is long. It is about 700 pages, so you do not have time to read it before NaNoWriMo. However, I have a way around this. So, just wait. You will still need to buy the book. You will still need parts of it. We're just going to speed the process up a little bit. His philosophy is that a genre is a plot system and a theme system. Most writers are afraid of theme. There's that old adage, like, if you want to send a message, try Western Union. So they end up avoiding theme. His point is that that's a huge mistake, because theme is what brings the reader back to the story, brings the reader back to stories in general again and again. It's the theme that the reader loves. He defines theme as the author's view of how to live successfully in the world. And his basic idea is that you express theme not by preaching in dialogue, but through the genre beats of the story. Now, here is a quick caveat. I have not read every single chapter in this book. I've read many of the sections. It is very long, and I just don't write in some of those genres and just didn't have interest in reading them. But every chapter is similarly structured, which is great. So there is a lot to work off of, and I found this incredibly helpful. And now we're going to talk about how you can use this incredibly helpful resource. It's all about mastering the 15 to 20 story beats that are unique to each genre. And so it's kind of save the cat, but the beats are very specific per genre. So in Save the Cat, you have your whole beat sheet, and then you have 3 things that are needed in each of their genres. This book, Anatomy of Genre, it has a specific like beat sheet sort of thing for every single one of the 14 genres that's unique to each one. And here we go. Let's talk about this process. So step number 1 is read the chapters for the genres that interest you. Remember, this book is fucking long. So choose the genres that you think your book could be, and then read those chapters. You probably want to read, I don't know, maybe four of the chapters, maybe 5. Each one takes 20-25 minutes to read, probably longer if you want to take notes, but we're going to read these chapters multiple times. For me, my current project is a YA heist thriller with a romance subplot. It's kind of funny, action-adventure-y, and so I read the action chapter, the love chapter, the comedy chapter, and then I'm also working on a play that is this like fun fantasy thing about queens. And so I read the gangster chapter and the fantasy chapter as well. So that is 5. Once you have read those chapters, identify the themes he states about each of these genres and use them as brainstorming points. So for example, what you're looking for is the second half of the chapter where he kind of has like recipe 4, and he goes into depth talking about the different themes. For example, in the action genre, he says that the value for action is about how to act successfully. Being, so each genre has a being statement. So in action, being is competing, fighting, winning, and losing. Each genre has a question. Does the hero stand and fight for what they believe in, or flee and stay alive? And each genre has a sort of moral argument. For action, it's you must always take action to defend your values and live a successful life, or it's beware of using immoral means to gain greatness. Comedy is similar. The deeper theme there is about tolerance. It's about the facades that people put up, how they screw up. The comic view is that kind of destroying falseness and fakeness leads to recreating society in a better form. The key question is kind of, do you lie or do you show your true self? And the sort of moral argument is we grow only by embracing ourselves as we really are and accepting the world as an imperfect and endlessly funny place. For gangster, the question is, how do you succeed in the city world without losing your soul? And the moral argument is something around sort of beware of false desire and immoral and illegal methods. If you act as if success is all about money and you do anything to get it, you'll destroy yourself and your family. It's a little bit of a downer, that one. And then the fantasy genre is about the values that create a better society. The question is, how do you live with style, spontaneity, and freedom? And the moral argument is that like freeing yourself to live with joy is the way to have a successful life, and it's important to live with childish wonder and playfulness at any age. Now, I know you're hearing this and you're thinking, these are not the values for like the moral arguments, the themes for all of the books that I have read in these genres. They don't look it on the surface, but he gives great examples. And if you think through the tenets, I have found that this is generally very, very true. The exception is where the genre is transcended. And he always talks about at the end of every chapter how to transcend that genre, how to make it, more unique, how to make it more advanced, more complex, more interesting. And so those can have some nuances where the moral argument is changed. We're not saying that this is the exact statement for every single story in that genre, but it's the general idea. He also tends to give like a positive and a negative for each one as well. So you have those themes, you've written down a question, sort of the moral argument he suggests, you sort of read some of the philosophy, and then what I would do is I would free write about these topics for maybe like 5-10 minutes each and think about how those themes apply to your story idea. So you're kind of trying to connect whatever theme it is. So in action, it would be, do you stand and fight for what you believe in or flee and stay alive? And here's your story idea. And where do these things kind of come together? Can you free write about how that is in that idea? Then I would take a note and think, what is interesting? What is coming easiest? Just kind of evaluate it, because you want to be interested in what you're writing about, if that makes sense, right? There's lots of writing advice that says, write what scares you, write what is hard to write about. The theme should matter to you in some way. All right. The next step in step 3 is choose a couple of examples he gives of each genre. So for example, in action, one of them is the Thomas Crown Affair, another is Ocean's 11. I'm writing a heist story, so I chose the one specific to my subgenre. In comedy, he lists The Devil Wears Prada, Legally Blonde. In the gangster genre, he lists The King's Speech, The Hunger Games, Game of Thrones, Mary Queen of Scots. And in fantasy, there is a crow outside my window and it is not going away. I hope you can't hear that. And in fantasy, I wrote down Mary Poppins, Harry Potter, and Chronicles of Narnia. The reason we're doing this is because we want to be able to go back to these stories and evaluate, does it make sense to me? Do they have this theme? Can I find these beats in this story? Because examples are the best way to learn, in my opinion, and you can see by seeing how other writers have done it, you can learn from them. So these are kind of your masterworks, your guides. And it also helps you figure out if it's a genre you should be writing in. For example, I didn't know anything pretty much in the horror genre. Maybe Jurassic Park. I found it really hard to find something that I knew. And so clearly I don't know enough about that genre, and I haven't experienced enough of those stories to write one. Step number 4 is to find the bit in the chapter where he discusses the hero's typical weaknesses and needs in that genre. So for example, in action, a typical weakness is being selfish, not wanting to rely on anybody, and being trapped in shame culture where their value comes from achievements and approval from others. The need is typically to grow in ways other than personal success. In comedy, the comedy section is really, really good. He gives like 8 different types of comedic characters, and you can immediately see how their plots shape up. It's really cool. He talks about the different weakness and needs for each of those different types of characters, and it's typically something like, gain confidence, stop using others, that sort of thing. In gangster, the sort of weakness is that the hero is trapped in this organization that uses physical force and immorality and stuff to succeed, or to get power, to get money, and they can't leave. They use sort of shame culture, valuing honor, appearance, strength, glory, pride, to justify bad actions, and they see freedom strictly in terms of money. I think of that more as like they see freedom strictly in terms of power. And then for fantasy, you're looking at, the positive elements of the fantasy story, of the world you've created are in some ways opposite to the hero's weakness. So it usually involves something like the hero needs to break through a convention, open their mind, learn to have fun, learn about love and friendship, that kind of thing. So these are your typical weaknesses and needs in the genre. Why are we doing this? Well, the hero's weakness and need is probably, arguably, along with the desire line, like the most important driving force in the story. So you want to see, okay, with this character that I have, does what they want actually fit any of these? And that's kind of, again, a helpful thing to figure out if your story is that genre. So for example, in an action story, one of the weaknesses is, violence is their first response to a problem. They won't rely on anything. They're out for personal glory. And a lot of it is about, or a lot of this sort of description in the chapter is talking about heroes, fighting for power and blah, 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 blah. Now, I'm writing a story that's a heist about a teenage musician who is very type A and doesn't do anything physically at all. But the weakness is that she wants glory, fame, or whatever through playing the violin, and she'll do basically anything to get that. She wants a specific violin musical thing. She'll do anything to get that, and she is so focused on personal success. So the need to grow in ways other than personal success fits for her perfectly, even though she's not a typical action hero. And you can, extrapolate this in many different areas as well. For all of the different genres, it may not be surface level, but deeper down in some of these stories, you can see that. So now at this point, just to kind of give an overview of what we've done, we've read a bunch of the chapters that are similar to our genre. We've identified the themes he talks about and tried to connect our story idea to those themes. We have chosen examples of masterworks of our favorite stories in these genres, and we've looked at the hero, their weakness, which basically gives an indication of their arc and who they are. Now, on step 5, we are going to identify where your story fits. So the question is, which genre does your story encompass for real? And does it fall in one of those transcendent genres? So if transcendent is confusing you, in an action story, for example, there's your typical action story, and then transcending it is like a sports story or something like a heist or a caper. In a fantasy, a transcendental genre is sort of the epic fantasy, the political fantasy epic. This is always at the end of the chapter, and it's very clear, and there's lots of examples, so it's kind of easy to tell. So if I'm writing a story, for example, like Game of Thrones, then I know that it's a transcendental form of both gangster and fantasy, if that makes sense. So it's always hard to figure out your genre. So I'm going to give 2 examples of my own stories and kind of explain how I did it. So my first one, my YA heist thriller, it is, I kind of threw out a couple of options. I know it's a heist story, which means it's definitely action. That's the primary genre for sure. It's a transcendent form of action. I thought my subgenre was maybe romance or comedy. It's definitely not. In terms of comedy, the character is not comedic. It's not about like putting on a false facade. None of the stories that they referenced really work with with the other elements of my story. So it's not comedy. That was really clear. It's a drama. If you look at like the comedy versus genre drama theatrical tradition. I thought it was romance, but reading his description about romance, I realized it is absolutely not. Romance is about characters, each sacrificing a little bit to form a communion with each other. Beats and conventions include the lovers break up. There are opponents, like competing people for affection. There are advisors in love, people giving advice about the relationship. I have none of this. So my book has romance elements, but it is not a romance. So does that mean it is only one story, it's only an action story? It doesn't, because as I was reading the fantasy chapter, I realized that actually fits my story really well. My character starts in a mundane world, and although the new world she goes to is real, it's not magical, there is this sense of fun, wonder, and playfulness. The theme of, being willing to live with more playfulness, live with more wonder, to value love and friendship, it fits perfectly. And so now I have a book that is a heist story with this kind of like fantasy, underlying. That's the basic subgenre though. And honestly, the moment I had that revelation, poof, blew my mind. Crazy. My second project, one that I am going to be working on for NaNoWriMo, is a play, and it's a project I originally called Kingdoms and Sisters, which is decidedly not about sisters. The original idea was about 4 girls from 4 different kingdoms who are educated together for a short period of time when they're young, and then they go off and they marry, and they each end up being queen of one of these kingdoms, and the kingdoms are fighting, and there's alliances, and blah, 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 blah. And their past relationships kind of guide what's happening. I realized in reading this book, actually, that is similar to the premise of Game of Thrones, which I have never seen. And so I thought that was kind of funny. But anyways, the story has evolved a bit. Now I have 2 girls. It's a little bit darker. I'm focusing on power dynamics and betrayal, while still looking at the idea of like how personal relationships influence political changes. So anyways, I'll stop talking about my stories in 1 second. I have been struggling with that because I know what I want to explore. And with plays, I find it so much harder to figure out your genre because I just haven't been to as many of them as I've read books. However, this Anatomy of Genre made it very clear to me. I am writing a fantasy political epic, which combines the fantasy genre and the gangster genre. There we go. Easy peasy. So step 6, now we're actually going to start planning your story. Step 6 is you get a massive notebook, like a sketchbook or something, or a computer screen, and I would divide it into 2. So on one side, write down all of your big ideas for the story. Characters, scenes, important moments, things you want to touch on, etc. Characteristics. I know it's hard to put all of your ideas on one page, but just kind of like the ones that make you the most excited, maybe. That's step 6. Then step 7 is on the other side of your page and or screen, write out the beats from the chapter, so the genre's story beats, in order. This is quite easy because if you look at the chapter, there is a section that says like action story beats or fantasy story beats, and it goes through them in order. So you just copy, like write the name of the beat with maybe a few defining characteristics. So for example, in the action genre, let me just pull one up here. So in action genre, one of the steps is the plan. And I have, okay, in the transcendental genres, subgenres of this, the sports, the war, the caper story, there's a detailed game plan involving the coordination of many people. The leader will sometimes spell this out in writing. It's intricate, and it has to be calibrated to seconds. So I would maybe put a few of those characteristics just underneath it to keep them in my mind, because that does distinguish it from other genres. Now this should be of your primary genre. Primary genre meaning it is the genre that like your main opponent, your main hero, and the desire line are all part of. More on that later. After you've listed the beats, write any of the techniques. He has sections in the book where he will label it like story technique. Write some of those below, write them below the story beats. And depending on what you're writing, you may want Story World to be on its own page, because for fantasy, for example, and for gangster, I think, that section is huge. So you just need to put your own, that might need its own world, or if it seems a little bit smaller, there's not as much content, it can just be on the bottom. Step 8 is to play the matching game. You are going to look at what you have, your ideas, and you are going to look at what you need to have for that genre, and you're going to be like, where do these pieces fit together? Literally like in school, drawing my lines across. This could be that, this could be that. For example, my character is a violinist and she desperately wants an internship. She'll do anything to get it, including stealing a violin, and that is her, that whole premise of like really wanting this internship, that is her action desire. I would draw my line over here. I know that in action there is a looming presence in my book of the mob that is kind of skulking around and creating issues, and that is our main opponent, the one who is not hidden, so I would draw a line there. 9, we are evaluating it. So first question, 3 questions to evaluate. Number 1 is, are these ideas on this side actually fulfilling the role they need to for that story beat? So I would go back to those characteristics and I would note, okay, yes, my character's desire is about success, glory, and personal freedom. That was one characteristic of desire in an action story. And the second is there needs to be a clear endpoint where the audience knows whether she succeeded or not. That is true. There is a clear endpoint where she knows, okay, that's fine, that's good. And do that for each of the beats. Am I fulfilling the criteria of this beat with this idea? Step 2, or question 2, is, am I missing anything? Which beats do I have nothing for? And here is where you brainstorm. Brainstorm to fill them in. Sit down with a piece of paper, use the sort of power of 10 rule where your first 10 ideas, only 10% of your ideas are actually good. So you have to write a list of at least 10 things in order to get a good idea. Maybe do 20. You don't want it to be the first thing that you think of. So for a beat, you brainstorm per beat. Question number 3, once you have sort of your story beats and you have a semi-good idea of what they're going to be, I would ask, is this actually any good? Is it derivative? Is there anything surprising? And can I make this better? And John Truby says that you can make it better by A, flipping what happens in the beat, that makes it more original, more surprising, or B, changing the order of the beats. So, can I flip what happens? Can I change the order? Will that serve my story? Those are the questions that you're thinking about as you look at that beat sheet. Step number 10 is to identify what your subgenres are. Now, what Truby says is that the best stories, the best modern stories, are a combination of 2 to 4 different genres. So you have a primary genre, which is your desire line, the main opponent, and the main hero, and then you have your subgenres. So for me, my primary genre of my current book is the action heist story. My secondary genre is a fantasy story. There are numerous ways you can do this, right? And It could be like it could be a horror with a romance. You see how you put them together. You be creative and try to pull from your story idea. Or if you really can't see how it fits more than one genre, maybe you use some of the chapters, some of the notes to inspire a secondary genre you can kind of mix in. Step 11 is to list out the story beats and techniques, etc. for each of the subgenres. So that's exactly what we just did for our primary genre. We're gonna do it for the subgenre. And I'm gonna do this, maybe I get another piece of paper or another document and I just kind of put it on the other side or next to my original ones. And I list everything out. Story beats, techniques, and story world. And then I do the same process. So I do my kindergarten matching, I brainstorm to fill in gaps, and I evaluate and think, can I flip this? Can I subvert expectations? Is this doing what it needs to do? However, the caveat is that you actually don't need to have all of these beats. Some of these beats you won't be using. So this is a quote from John Truby's, he did a great podcast interview on the Creative Pen that I will link below. He says, add the beats from the other genres, but only when they work with the main genres. So if they contradict a beat from the main genre, and one reason that genres are different from each other is their story beats sometimes are in direct opposition. So when that occurs, you don't include the beat from the subgenre because you want to keep the plot beats of the main genre first. So for example, I have two examples here. The opening beat of an action story he calls the hero's defining crisis. And the opening beat of a fantasy story is called the slow open. Not necessarily slow, it just means that you're in the ordinary world, taking time to establish the hero's weakness. With these, I can combine them together. The hero can have a defining crisis that shows her taking decisive action in the ordinary world. A different one is the plan. In an action caper, there is a highly complex plan involving the coordination of many people. Sometimes the leader spells out the plan in writing. They make the plan intricate, and the plan has to be calibrated to the split second. In fantasy, in a positive world, which mine is, he suggests that many good things happen to the hero, and near the end, there's a negative trigger that sends them home. I'm pretty much going to be ignoring that fantasy plan convention beat and just focusing on the action element. Also, there's another beat or technique in fantasy about the passageway. And because mine actually is not magical, it just like feels like a new world, the passageway doesn't really fit in. So I'm not going to include that beat either. All right, step 12, we're almost there, is to write out your story spine. And to this to me is the heart of the story. And I like to keep that like as a sticky note on my computer or just at the top of every document I ever make for the story. And it is these three things. It's what the character wants, it's their character's weakness, need, and then maybe it's four things. It's a question I'm wanting to explore, and then it's the theme and or the moral argument. Note that if you're using the anatomy of genre, this is harder to do than with Save the Cat or Story Grid because Truby gets really into complex themes. He lays out multiple options for what the theme, the controlling idea of that genre could be. He expresses the positive version, the negative version. He talks about, he expresses things in different ways. So, in action, he talks about how it's about, choosing, or it's about standing up and fighting. Like, will you fight or will you run away? And then in another paragraph, he goes in and says, action is really about choice. Took me a second to connect them. It's obviously the same thing, but one might resonate more with you than another. So, you want to figure out what resonates with you when it comes to theme, because there is a lot in here, the thing that you're really taking away, the thing that stands out in your head, and write it on that piece of paper. Now, this book has complex theme because the kind of ethos is that the way to write a good story these days is advanced theme expressed through complex plot. So of course the themes are going to be multi-layered and blah, 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 blah. You're just taking the essence that you want to have in your head always. So what does the character want? What is their weakness and or need? Whichever one resonates more with you. A question you're exploring, it might be from the genre. It might just be like related. You might tailor it to yourself. And then your moral argument. And then step 13 is return to your regularly scheduled programming. So at this point, if you're a pantser, you might be done and you feel like you have enough to get going. If you're a plotter, maybe you start doing some outlining. I would suggest going through the anatomy of story to continue working and developing your story. Any techniques you've used before, there's plenty of videos that I have as well about, developing your characters and getting ready to write a novel. So you go through and return to kind of whatever process works for you while continuing to refer back to your story spine, so that little sticky note, and use that as your guiding principle, and referring back to sort of continuously the story beats and the information on your genre. So overall, that is a long but really good possible process for how you could use the anatomy of genre to prepare for NaNoWriMo. I know this was a very long video. I would love to hear, how do you use genre in your preptobering and your novel plotting? Have you read the anatomy of genre or the anatomy of story? Have you found any other books that attempt to do this, attempt to break down genre in such detail? I can't wait to hear about it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.